It had been a really warm summer's morning. Two brothers had been up in the field fixing a dry stone wall that had been damaged in the winter storm. But at the point where the sun reached its zenith, they looked at each other, gave a little nod, and each understood that it was time for a break. They downed their tools, wandered across the field, over the stile, down a steep, grassy bank into the bottom of a small valley, where a brook meandered its way through the sedge and cotton grass. Now, the brothers had played here many, many times as children, and they knew that it was the only place on a day like today to find any significant shade that was provided by a fairly nondescript gritstone crag. When they reached the crag, they lay down in the pool of shade, the peat soft against their back, the grass surrounding them as cool as that first breeze on a summer's evening. Sleep came really easily to Richard, and it wasn't very long before his eyes had closed and his breath had reached a nice even rhythm. But for James, who was the older of the two brothers, sleep was slower coming. Eventually, the warmth of the day enveloped him like a warm blanket, and he found himself drifting off to sleep. Then suddenly, a movement caught his eye. He turned to face his brother just in time to see a creature, something crawling from his brother's mouth, skittering down his body and into the sedge grass to one side of him. James craned his neck, but he couldn't see the creature, only the grass, shuddering from one side to the other as the creature made its progress towards the edge of the brook. At the edge of the brook, the creature emerged, and to James's absolute amazement, it was a honeybee. The honeybee ran along the edge of the water until it reached a thin twig that was balanced from one bank to the other. And it used the twig to cross the water below and gained access to the bottom of the crag. At the bottom of the crag, the little bee started to climb. It went up and up and up until just before reaching the top, it disappeared into a little crevice. James could see from where he was sitting that the crevice was filled with spider webs, and he wondered whether the little bee would even make it out the other side. So he stood up in curiosity to see what would happen next, and as he did so, the bee popped out at the top of the crag, just underneath a thicket of gorse and ling heather. James was amazed. He was astonished. He bent down as if to wake up his brother, and at that moment the little bee flew from the top of the crag and with the speed of a peregrine falcon in full dive, straight into his brother's mouth between his teeth. At that moment, Richard woke up with a start. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" he said to James. "Why did you wake me up? I was having the most unbelievable dream." "I dreamt that I'd been given a quest by a queen. I'd had to battle my way through a dense forest where the trees were so tall I couldn't see the sky above me. Then I found myself at a raging river. It was impassable. I'd walked for days along the banks until I found a tiny, rickety bridge that could barely take my weight, and I'd fought my way across it, nearly losing my footing so many times, knowing that if I did, I would have been swept to my death. And then when I finally reached the castle, I was faced with an impenetrable wall. I had to climb without ropes. If I'd taken one false stepping, I would have fallen to my death. Eventually, I reached the castle gates. The castle gates were so heavily guarded by the most terrifying guards. But I fought my way through all of them until finally I made it through into the castle keep. And there, in front of me, was the most beautiful treasure. A pile of gold bigger than you could possibly imagine, surrounded with shimmering amethysts. And just as I was about to reach out and take some of the treasure, you woke me up. Richard stood up and brushed the soil off himself before walking in a bit of a huff down the valley, back up the grassy slope and over the stile. James, he stood there for a little bit. watching the little honeybees working the ling heather, listening to the gentle hum they made. He shook his head, gave a little shrug, before turning and following his brother up the grassy bank and back to work.